From the Spec Network, this is Fragmented, an Android developer podcast where we talk about building good software and becoming better Android developers. I'm Don Felker.
And I'm Kaushik Gopal.
Welcome to the show.
Before we kick off today's show, I want to take a quick moment and thank Rollbar for sponsoring this show. Dealing with errors suck. You have this new feature that's hitting only a subset of users, but you're somehow running into a problem and you can't really ask your users to give detailed report because let's be honest, A, it's hard for users to actually give a detailed report that could help you as a developer, and B, more importantly, don't do that. Don't ask your users to give you an error. You should be able to collect that information on your own. And if you're wondering how, Rollbar is a library that can help with that. They work with all the major languages and frameworks, Android, iOS, even the backend, Rails, Ruby, all of it. We use them at Instacart and we rely pretty heavily on this to report good errors. They recently did a complete overhaul of their new Java SDK for both Android and the Java library, and it's all on GitHub. I'll add a link to the show notes. You can hop on over, browse GitHub, try it out, see some of the examples, look through their code, and you know what? If you see something that you think jumps out or that they can do better, go ahead and let them know. You can maybe even open a GitHub issue in there and tell them how stuff can be changed. With Rollbar, you can start tracking your production errors just in minutes. Head on over to rollbar.com/fragmented and you can get their bootstrap plan for free. Make sure to use our special link, rollbar.com/fragmented, and they'll know you came from us. And it'll help support the show. Thanks again, Rollbar.
In this episode, we sit down and talk with Hannes Dorfmann about the MVI pattern. MVI stands for Model View Intent. Now, if you're familiar with MVP, which is Model View Presenter, or MVVM, which is Model View View Model, well, this will come off as a very similar in nature type of pattern. It's for Android, but it's actually inspired from cycle.js from the JavaScript world. It's very interesting in how you can kind of implement it. It's very unidirectional data flow oriented. Hannes goes into very deep detail about how you can implement it, how we can test it, the benefits, maybe some of the cons of it. Overall, it's a fantastic episode. We get really deep into technical implementation, and we really hope you enjoy it. Kaushik, a lot of folks were really excited about the chat about hardware that we had on our last episode. That was very surprising.
That is interesting. Given that we are like a software development podcast for the most part, it is always surprising. But people love their phones, man. People love their devices. So anytime there's hardware talk, it's interesting to see how excited people are about it.
There is. There's a whole podcast dedicated to it, but that's not why we're here. We're a software development podcast about Android. And we're lucky enough to have another great guest on the show. It's one that I'm really excited about myself, and I know that you're excited about as well.
Oh, yeah.
So without further ado, I would like to announce Hannes Dorfmann. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm a big fan of the show. Listener since episode 1.
Woo!
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Hannes, I think your middle name is Mosby, right? So it's Hannes Mosby Dorfmann. I think that's what everyone calls you by, right? So
Almost, yeah.
Now, a lot of folks may have read your blog posts, which I'm sure they have. They're very prolific. You're out there quite a bit. But for the folks that maybe are not familiar with you, your background, kind of things that you've written and created out there, would you mind explaining kind of who you are, maybe what you've worked on, kind of things you've created, where you've worked, how long you've been involved in Android and so forth, and kind of what you do in the Android community?
Yeah, sure. So Android and it wasn't really love at first sight.
You wouldn't say.
Yeah. So I have started, let's say, as a teenager with hacking around with my Nokia and Symbian OS back then, some kind of little apps, but it wasn't really an SDK for programming apps like we know it from nowadays, SDKs like the Android one. And then I went to university, and at university I did a lot of C++ and Qt.
Oh, wow.
Which is a UI framework, yeah. And then this thing like, what was it called? This operating system by Nokia. I think it was Maemo, or not sure how to pronounce it.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I remember that. The Nokia communicator and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. For the N900 or whatever Nokia series it was.
Right.
Yeah, and I was really deep into that UI. apps programming already there. And then this Android thing came out, or at least in my world, it crashed in. so I tried to write some Android apps. It was somewhere in 2009, 2010. So probably, it definitely was before Android 2.0.
Wow.
It was like probably Android 1.6 or something like that. And I tried to start with Android development, and I was all like, yeah, where's my main method? What is this XML thing here? What is this find do by ID stuff? And
where's my main method? That should be the title. I love that post.
Yeah.
Where's my main method?
Yeah, and simple things like passing dependencies in through a constructor, which I was used to do all the time in C++ and so on. It wasn't there, so I tried it a little bit. I have written a hello world, and then I quit it. And not really 1 month, but a few months later, I have bought a Motorola Droid. Then I have started really to go deeper with this SDK that Google provided us and started doing Android development. And yeah, fast forward today, at the moment I'm unemployed because I'm leaving my current, I have left my previous company called Tickaroo here in Munich, Bavaria, Germany. And now I'm joining Freeletics in a few weeks, which is another company here in Munich.
Fantastic.
Congratulations,
yeah.
Oh, thanks.
And you also run The Context, another Android development podcast. We'll make sure to have a link in the show notes. We are big fans and we are listeners as well.
Oh, thank you.
So thank you for also pushing that out.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really impressed. And I have also asked that question you have mentioned in episode 100, how you were able to produce that much episodes that frequently, because I know how much work it is, and kudos to you guys.
Don is actually an Android. He's not a human being. He just he's a machine. He gets all the stuff.
Actually, I thought that someone of you is an artificial intelligence and doing all this recording and post-production automatically.
It's him. It's totally him.
Kaushik makes the magic happen.
In any case, Hannes, me and Don have been waiting for this episode for so long because it's a topic that's near and dear to our heart. We have talked about different variants, and that is basically the model view intent pattern. And every time we talk to even listeners, many of them have been asking for this. So this is long overdue. So we want to definitely kick this conversation off and ask you, can you tell us about the model view intent pattern? Why you sort of came up with something like this, or at least your variant of this? Why not MVP, MVVM? We have so many of them. Why couldn't you just use that? Why did you have to come up with something else?
Yeah, good question. So I haven't really invented it.
What?
I'm not the creator of this pattern. No, I have borrowed it from the JavaScript world.
Oh, really?
Actually, it was André Medeiros, which is better known as André Staltz in the web, who has defined this model view intent naming, or this pattern, or the idea of this pattern, for the library he has worked on called cycle.js.
Oh yeah.
And as the name already suggests, it's an architectural pattern like model view presenter, model view model, or model view controller, to separate the UI, the view layer, from your model. Let me actually ask you a question. What is your favorite architectural pattern? Which one are you using now?
Ooh.
It's hard to say. I'm migrating more towards MVVM right now. But after I continually read your series and reread it again, I'm getting more convinced maybe MVI is where I want to go, but we'll let you convince us of that. So I'd have to say probably I went from MVP to MVVM now.
Yeah, it's pretty much the same for me. I started out with MVP, then I went to MVVM. Now I currently I used something that was like a mishmash of the two. And then I'm like, actually, this is like way too much abstraction. So I'm just going to use this. Now, however, there's this other person who's been talking about model view intent. So I've been very actively convinced of this pattern. And, I've been using a variant of this. And this is also why it's interesting for us, because I haven't actually used every single part of your pattern, the MVI pattern, but I've been using a lot of the state management and the way you talk about your model and the reactive sort of patterns to that. So for me, that's basically what I've been doing.
Awesome. yeah, that was actually also the question I've asked myself probably 2 or 3 years ago. Like all this pattern, we're talking about a model. So model view controller talking about the model view presenter talking about a model. And the question I've asked myself is, what is actually a model? And
right.
So if you look back at the original definition of model view controller, which was defined by Reenskaug back in 1979, he was a Smalltalk programmer and looking for a way to separate his UI from the model. And what he basically did is, let's start with a concrete example. Like if you have a button and the button displays hello, then he would have had a model that has, let's call it button model. And this button model has just a property text or button text. And there would be something like this, like a string. And then the view, the button, would observe the model for this field exactly. So then the controller comes in the middle. And what is the controller? The controller is not what we would nowadays call controller. Like, you have view controller on iOS. We have controller on the web somewhere. I don't know. So controller is used in many places for many different definitions and use cases. But Reenskaug's definition of a controller was more like a click listener. So if you click on that button, the controller, which was the click listener, then would talk to the model and say, okay, now set the text of this model, of this button model class to world. And now the view would be updated because the view is observing the model, and then world would be displayed as the text of the button. So that was the original definition or the original idea. So in model view presenter, model view model, we actually don't have that anymore, right? Or at least the most implementations don't have such a thing like the model is observed by the view or something like that. We have this new view model in MVVM, but is it really the same as the original model definition or use case of model? I have some doubts. So I've started looking around, and I'm not a super, well, I was doing web development a little bit in high school and so on, but then I started looking around at solutions on other platforms, and at this MVI thing from the web, cyclejs came in, was really a fresh breath of air regarding this concept of model and functional programming and XJava. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the main point there was that the model is actually the same as a state. So if we treat a model as a state like Reenskaug did, our view is basically just displaying that state. And that was the way how I get started with model view intent.
I love this definition. We'll definitely add this to the show notes. And Don mentioned this earlier, but you have this whole series where you talk about the MVI patterns, and, you have like a 4-part, 5-part series. And I think the very first one, in the first post, you do talk about this model state thing, right? And I thought it's so fascinating because we've been so accustomed to MVC, MVP, MVVM, and many a times, you're totally right. The M portion, we've forgotten what the M really stands for. It's not necessarily for the database model or the entity model alone. That's not really, the core of what the M stands for, at least in the context of this pattern, right? Is that a fair summary of what you're saying? It's literally the model here is not of your entity, but it's of what is being shown or presented on the screen. You're trying to make that into a model, right?
Exactly. So quite often I read some blog posts where model is referred to something like the retrofit interface to communicate with the backend.
Right.
But I agree what you said. That's a good summary of what a model should be. Yeah. Then the next part of this pattern is basically the intent. So in general, this pattern is quite easy to explain it, but it's probably not that easy to program it because it may require a little bit understanding of state management, of Android internals, and and the like. But the idea is quite simple. So the view is displaying the model. That is what we have already said, right? And the intent is basically just let's call it command or intention.
Let me reel back here for folks listening. When we say model view intent, are we talking about an Android intent? or something different?
That's a good question. No, actually, that's something different. Yeah, that's completely different. But that's a good point. Yeah, naming is hard.
So it's not an Android intent. It's like you said. It's like like we can interchange that word intent with maybe like a command, right? We're saying this is a command. We want to do something, right?
Yeah, exactly. Let's call it command then.
The English definition of the word intent versus
right.
the Android definition of the word. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. So intent or command then basically is the intention to change something. So if I click on the button, I would trigger clicked on the button intent or command. And then I would let this information of this command flowing down through my business logic. And then my business logic would take this intent and compute the new model. And I'm explicitly saying new model because
right.
Here comes the next thing, immutability. And I think you have already talked about the advantages and disadvantages along with your effective Java episodes. I guess it was episode or item number 14 or 15 or something like that.
Wow, you're good.
Wow, yeah.
I don't even have memorized. You're good.
No, I'm not sure. Not sure. Don't quote me.
And Don made the episode. So
but yeah, the idea is that the model is immutable. Then we get all these advantages like thread safety and so on. And we really ensure that nobody else can manipulate this model except the business logic because it's creating a new model. And then, as already said, the intent is handled by the business logic, and a new model will then be simply passed to the view or back to the view, and the view is basically just displaying whatever this model.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I have a quick follow-up thought on that. You mentioned business logic, right? And I want to call this out because you've made this very clear in your posts too. Can you give examples of what business logic means in your context?
Yeah.
Is it like this repository pattern thing? Is it the retrofit? Because you mentioned the retrofit thing before, right? Because I think there's a special meaning to this business logic that's allowed to create these new models. They're triggered by the intent, like you say, or the intention. And the business logic then creates this new model. Can you give us like an example of what this business logic is?
Yeah. So when we talk about business logic, it really depends on what your app is actually doing. But if your app is just loading some JSON data from the web, then probably the retrofit interface would be a part of the business logic. So I would say the business logic is some kind of facade or entry point, and then it will communicate with this retrofit interface, load the data, get the data back, and then and then decide whether or not this request was successful or has failed. Then it will produce the model that has an error state or a model that has the success state and the data. So that's basically
got it.
That's basically the idea. Yeah.
Got it. That makes sense. So even if it was like a local database or a network server, essentially that business logic somehow pulls the data that you need. It transforms it in a way that your view can consume and then creates the model in quotes, the new model, the immutable model from that. So that's all. Anything that does that is basically your business logic.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, I think one of the things I like to try to do when I'm explaining these complex topics, and again, this is, this is very difficult over an audible medium such as a podcast, but maybe I was wondering if you could provide a real world example, maybe even just like a simple application of, hey, I have a user who is going to who's going to log in. I need to provide a username and password. They hit a button, and then they're going to go and some type of request happens, and let's say hypothetically it succeeds, and then they land on the home screen of the application. If you were to walk me through what that would look like in an MVI type of application, what would be the steps of like showing the first screen? I'm sure I'm going to have some type of model, and then do I have an intent that says, hey, load the first screen, or how does that all wire together? And then when I click on a button, where does that go? Is that an intent that's fired, or does that talk to the model? I know you explained it a little bit, but I'm just trying to wire it all together here so we can kind of get the full picture. Is that something you might be able to explain at all?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so Let's start with an MVP-ish approach. So in MVP, you would have a view. Your view would have a reference to the presenter. So the view knows the presenter, right?
Yep.
And then you would invoke a method on that presenter. So in MVI, we turn around the table. In MVI, the view doesn't have a reference to the presenter, but rather the view would allow the presenter to subscribe to observe the view. In more detail, to observe intents. So we could say that the view interface would offer a button clicked intent, like the login button clicked in your example.
Would that be like an RX observable maybe that I could subscribe to?
Yeah. So usually I would use RX Java. You don't necessarily have to use RX Java, but I personally don't think that there is any better tool for doing that at the moment.
Right.
So I would go for RX Java. But yeah, then your view interface would offer an RX Java observable of, let's say, user credentials, which would be username and password. And whenever you click the submit button in the view, the presenter will get notified about this intention. And then the presenter will forward this to the business logic. The business logic layer then is doing the HTTP request to your backend with these credentials. And the thing is, before starting the request, we would like to present in our UI that we are now loading data, right? So probably we would like to show a progress bar or something like that. So the business logic will get the intent, the login or sign in intent. And before actually starting the HTTP request, it will change the model from, being idle or showing the form where you can enter the username and password to showing loading. And then the view will get this updated model. As said before, it's immutable and will display this progress bar because this model now contains, let's say, Boolean flag where loading is set to true or something like that. Then the HTTP request will be triggered and the result will be loaded. And then the business logic decides, okay, now the login was successful because the server has sent back a HTTP to 200 response or something like that. And then the model would say, the business logic will create a new model with saying logged in or something like that. And the UI, the view would then display that. So in an MVP world, your view interface would have observables or one single observable for the intent and one render method, or I call it render method. And this render method is basically, this render method is basically just taking one single parameter, which is the model. So the presenter is just calling this method to let the view know that there's not something new you should now render or display or adjust your UI widget accordingly.
Perfect. In many ways, you've sort of simplified the responsibility, so to speak,
exactly.
for the presenter, but essentially the view. Sorry, like the view. Basically, all the view does is like, hey, I got this new model. Again, in quotes, this is like I'm going to keep calling this the Hannes model now because it's easier to. So, hey, I got a new Hannes model. So render on the screen. The first one that they got is like this loading model. Okay, render that. And then like the business logic says, okay, success or error again. And this translates down to the render method, which has a new model, and then it presents it on the screen, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So if you're familiar with RX Java, basically you have some kind of a stream where the business logic is pushing a new item or emitting a new model whenever something internally changed, like doing the HTTP request and getting the result and so on. And the view is basically just displaying whatever now the new Hannes model is.
Right. Yeah. And the reason, and this, I guess this is why like the whole reactive thing makes sense, because you're observing the changes, right? Otherwise, if you had to like manually do it every time, it would not make sense.
Yeah. So RX Java is really good at modeling events over time. And that's exactly what's happening in most of our applications. Like we have input events, like pressing buttons, entering text. Right. And we also have the other direction where the business logic is pushing some events as reaction on some other events. But it could also be a push notification that could trigger or seen as an intent that changes the model, the business. Yeah, at the end it changes the model, but through the business logic. And the main idea is here that we have a unidirectional data flow, and the state is driven by the business logic. So we don't get in weird scenarios where the UI has a different state that than the business logic. Like starting an HTTP request, then our activity gets destroyed because we're doing some config change and coming back, and now we kind of have to try to get back to the proper state by just looking at some states saved in the bundle and some internals of the activity, and some other internals are in the business logic layer. Some state is kept into the presenter. So we really avoid that from the very beginning and just saying, let's do that let's drive the state through our business logic here.
I want to rehash something that you said earlier. And the question I had asked was, okay, we click the button, the user logs in. You told us how it happens with the HTTP request going through, succeeding with the 200. We come back, and then we send off a new model to the view saying, hey, the login was successful. Now, at that point in time, as a developer, I know that my login is successful. I may then decide in that model that I want to dismiss, all right, the login's successful, which means I'm going to dismiss the loading dialog or whatever that is. And then at that point in time, I need to start a new activity because I need to do something different. Is that being defined in the fragment or in the activity, or who is actually starting the activity and who actually manages that?
Oh, that's an excellent question. And that's something many patterns would say that's out of the scope of this pattern. Like in MVP, you would say, yeah, maybe in the presenter, maybe in the view, but that's out of the scope of this this model.
Right,
Just do whatever works best for you.
Totally. That's exactly that's exactly what's been responded. Yeah.
And in MVI, you can say the same. So it's up to you. But what MVI is really nice about is that we have a single state just for this UI, for this part of the UI, or for this part of the screen, or for the whole scheme, or whatever it is. So you can really break down complex screen into, let's call it, little MVI units, and they all have their own state, and probably they communicate with each other. But that's also another thing. They don't communicate with each other through a presenter or inventors or something like that. But it's always the business logic who communicates kind of through this UI.
Fascinating. So what you're saying is, sure, whoever at the down the line, the view should basically know how, like, that render method that you talk about. When you render one particular state, it should know that it has to launch. So the actual launching of the activity probably happens either in the activity or like whatever implements the view. But I think your point is you would create a new version of a Hannes model that would say, hey, if you see this model, basically, then you need to know that you have to launch a new activity. So that's how it's driven by the business logic. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, my goodness.
Yes, you can do so. But I have messed this up a little bit now as I'm looking back at what I've said before. So that's still true what I've said before. But navigation, or what I wanted to say is by re-explaining that the business logic is driven by the state, that navigation is not really affecting the state of this UI widget, right? So if you say that our view, so instead of a UI widget, let's say that our login screen as a whole should now be changed. But the state of the login screen itself is it's not affected by navigation, right? Because the state is still the same. So in MVI, we can treat navigation as kind of a side effect. So with RxJava, there is something like do a next, which is exactly the right operator for that. So in our presenter, we could say whenever we get a new state, do a next, and now we check, okay, if the HTTP request was successful, or we get the Hannes model that says successful, logged in, then we could say do a next operator on our stream and call something like a navigator class and say now start a new activity, whatever it is, like the home activity or whatever.
I think, it makes perfect sense. Basically, this is a perfect use case for a side effect, right? So if you see a success Hannes model coming in down your stream, then either wherever you're listening, so in your view, so to speak, you can say, hey, if you notice a success, then model this side effect where you actually launch the new screen. And I think the reason it's okay in this case is because you can reproduce it, right? And I think that's essentially what like the pattern like hopes to achieve. So if for some reason you, while you're testing or something, you happen to launch this model, or like, you say, I'm going to test, let me provide this Hannes model and see what happens, to the screen. Hopefully, when you send this Hannes model, and only this Hannes model, essentially it understands that this side effect needs to be executed, and it does the same thing. So it's almost reproducible in some ways, right?
Yeah, that's true.
I think that's exactly what you're saying, and he says this in his blog posts. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you use the mathematical example of f of x equals y or something like that. And you said not to get too mathematical into it, but as software engineers, we understand that, from a functional perspective, if we provide a function with a particular value, we should always get the same result. And that's what this seems like it's doing here is if I give the view a particular model, I should always have a particular the same exact output, which to me kind of made my mind explode like, oh, whoa, I can now test the exact state of my screen if I just provide it with the model that I needed to render. So if I needed to show a button color that's, I need to show the dialogue that's loading, well, then I can just pass that model in. And if I'm running an Android test, I can just, hey, is my dialogue or my loading screen, is my loading whatever spinner showing? I can verify that. If it's this other model gets passed in, well, then this one should actually navigate us to another activity. And other one happens, this exact thing should happen. It should be very repeatable. It's very functional in that approach. That's kind of how my whole synapses just started exploding. Is that understanding correct, Hannes?
That's a perfect sum up. Yeah. And actually it makes testing much more easier, I think, than compared to traditional MVP or MVVM or whatever.
So can we talk about that? Why does it make testing easier? And
yeah.
This was like mind blowing because the promise is so great. It's basically what you're telling us, like, oh, just given one state of the model, like I could test any screen. I know what I expect from my output, right? Can you talk to us about why this MVI helps so much in testing and how it improves this layer? Like you said it best, it's actually even easier than MVP and MVVM, right? So can you tell us why?
Yeah, sure. So we still can write unit tests, or let's start with simple unit tests. We can unit test our business logic. We can unit test our HTTP request with a mock HTTP server and so on. So we still can do that. But is it really required to do that if we write our code with pure functions, like Don have mentioned before, with immutability and pure function that always return the same result for whatever we pass in as argument, we get the same value back. So if we follow that principle, we could go one step further and say, instead of writing unit tests, we could actually write whole integration tests. Because since we are sure that our business logic doesn't have any bad side effects, they behave always the same. So it doesn't make much sense to write a unit test for, let's say, our HTTP request and integration test that also does the HTTP request. So testing the things twice is not really useful at this, or doesn't add any other value, right? So what we can now do with MVI is basically we can write integration tests that at the end of the day will just have the following line, like trigger non-intent, and then asset equals expected model is what the actual model from the render method was. And that's how we can cover a whole application as integration tests without writing unit tests or having duplicated tests that do the same thing twice or multiple times. And since all of them are immutable, we can also go one step further and write espresso tests as integration tests. So we really have kind of end-to-end tests by starting in the UI layer. And probably we would mock our HTTP server, because we always want to get the same response back. But what we now can do is, what I have seen developers doing in the past is using Espresso for verifying that, for instance, the list they are displaying through Recycle view is the expected one. So they are using some view matchers to get the actual data set of the Recycle view and so on. But that's completely unnecessary to do with MVI because we have the whole model in the view layer. We can kind of intercept it and check for it.
Oh, interesting. So could you maybe bring it together with like the login example? Because right now, I think in all of our minds, the login example is clear, right? So in my login activity, you're saying, would you store the Hannes model inside the view and then in Espresso check, like, with the view tag or something that it exists? How would you,
how do you do that?
Yeah, kind of. So what I would do is, or what I do in my apps, I introduce another, not really another layer, but another component within my view layer. So my activity doesn't have any find view by ID calls or something like that. That's something I call a view renderer. And this view renderer basically gets instantiated on create activity. It gets the root view, and then internally it makes all this find view by ID. And that find view by ID is now entirely within the view layer. And also this view renderer has a render method that gets the model and then has the references to the UI widgets and displays them accordingly. So now we inject that view renderer in our activity. And during unit tests,
Unit or integration?
Integration tests. During our integration tests, we inject a wrapper around this renderer, or we can also do that by inheritance, whatever works best for you. And now we are intercepting the render methods, the render events. So we're intercepting the Hannes model.
Right.
So now our Espresso test, our integration test just looks like, okay, trigger A, and then wait for we were by the login example. So trigger the login button. Then I expect that as next state, the show progress model, Hannes model is displayed. And then I expect that the HTTP request is successful and the successful state is rendered on the screen. And we can do that now by having just an activity that is kind of lifecycle container and a view renderer that is responsible for rendering the view, triggering the intents, and we can run our integration test with almost 100% production code by just intercepting the render events and then verify the render events for the corresponding or expected model.
So how do you still verify that the dialogue was actually showed, like a progress dialogue? I mean, I know they're deprecated, but how do you verify that the actual progress spinner was still shown? We may have actually decided on the model, hey, that we want this to be shown. We're intercepting that, so we're verifying that that's correct, that flag has been set. But how do we know that it's actually being shown on the screen?
Yeah, our renderer, a view renderer, we use for our test. So we have not a mock, but a slightly different implementation that uses the real implementation, but adds some kind of queue that intercepts all our render events. Mm-hmm. And now we inject this testing view renderer in our application or in our activity. And then within Espresso, we use the same reference to this view renderer and just ask the view renderer for get me the latest results, the latest render events, and verify that with the expected one. Like we would have something like asset expected, that the view state, the view that has been rendered is loading to true. So that would be our first assertion. Then our second assertion would be next I expect an event where the view render is now rendering to a successful state. And the other nice thing, we don't really need idling resources for that. So we just use Espresso for like triggering an intent, like we would use on view with ID r.id.button or login button just to trigger the intent. But we don't really have to use any kind of idling resources mechanism to notify that our Espresso should go on, because all of that is an observable stream, and we can then wait for the observable stream to emit, to push the models. You know what I mean? Does it make sense?
I think the clarification, when you fire out, the login intent, I think we should make sure that that's the intention. That's not like, again, it's not the Android intent. I'm just trying to clarify.
Yeah, it's the command, yeah.
Yeah, it's the command saying, hey, we want to fire off this login command. It's a login. It's our intention to log in. The only thing that's not making sense for me just yet is you said we don't need an idling resource, but we're using Espresso. Why don't we need that idling resource? Because it seems if we're doing something on a background thread, we'd still have to wait, and Espresso might not wait for us.
Yeah, because this view renderer basically offers now also a kind of observable. And then in our espresso test, we can just say something like wait blocking for the next event. And then we continue with our verification.
So it's kind of a shim that we shove in the middle that we can kind of intercept and say, hey, hey, change the schedule, or so there's no schedule, or put it on an immediate schedule, or just make it blocking or something like that.
No, we don't do that. We run on 100% production code. We just have this layer, which I call view renderer, which you can think of it as a publish subject, which intercepts the stream and publishes on a publish subject. And then the UI test, the integration test is listening on that on that state subject and verifies from there.
Okay.
So it's a little bit hard to explain over audio, I know.
Of course. Yeah. Then the last one, I don't know if I'm asking it, I'm probably asking it incorrectly. We've verified that the state is coming back, that we know that the view state is, we're showing this dialogue. But how do I actually, I'm going to be the devil's advocate here, is like, how do I actually know that it's on the screen? Because in Espresso, I may say, hey, on view with ID, check that it is displayed. Like, how do I know that actual view is being displayed? Is that handled in MVI, or am I just understanding it incorrectly?
No, that's a good point. So how I do that usually is I do a screenshot test for that. I don't see much value in actually trying to verify UI properties. It might make sense to do that for visibility of a UI widget, but verifying if a certain text is displayed that's on a button or something like that, I don't think that that's the way to go, because we can already handle that with the view state we got with the Hannes state we got from the presenter, from the business logic. So we can assume that this is the correct one, but we actually want to know that if it's displayed or not. So back to our view renderer. During unit tests, we use this slightly modified view renderer, which not only intercepts this Hannes states, so like the login state has been started to loading, now it's successful. All of that is being intercepted by this view renderer, but also at the same time, whenever we get a new view intent, we make a screenshot of our app. And that's how we can really nicely make full UI and integration tests at the same time without having to mock a lot of things. Actually, we don't mock anything. Probably we only mock the web backend, our server. Mm-hmm. But apart from that, we run on 100% production code.
Interesting.
Wow. Okay.
And the follow-up question that I had is this view renderer that you're talking about, because the natural question is like, oh, can you show me what this view renderer looks like? You have a library, I believe, right, which actually does this. So if folks are interested, they can just use this. Is that a correct assumption?
Yes and no. So I do have this little library called Mosby, which also offers this model view intent kind of library of. I wouldn't call it framework. For me, it's more like a library, because you can use it, but you don't have to use it. Mm-hmm. You can use some parts of it. And there you also find some examples. Actually, the view renderer is not yet part of the examples, but I will add it. I was holding back that for some conferences talk. And I will also write a blog post about that soon. So you can look that up in my blog or in this example repository for Mosby. And I also have to say that Mosby is more inspired by Model View Presenter. Therefore, we have this MVP-ish implementation of MVI, but we can also do MVVM-ish implementation of MVI, where the view would have, we could use, for instance, the architecture components view model, and we would pass then the view would have a reference, and instead of having would have a reference to the presenter, instead of having an interface where the view model is subscribing to, we would go the other way around. So that layer it around, like the view subscribes to the view model. So we can also do that way around, and Mosby is also offering that. But in my blog post, I went with the MVP-ish route, because I don't want that my view has a reference to the presenter.
Right.
So we can argue whether or not there's an advantage or a disadvantage, but it really depends on what you're trying to do. And most of the time I try to reuse UI widgets, and UI widgets are so much easier to reuse if they don't know about the presenter or view model in that case.
That's fair. And that's like an episode and a new episode of its own,
Yeah.
whether to have the reference or not.
One thing about testing, or one important thing about testing is also that we can debug and reproduce it quite easily with MVI, because everything is immutable. We know which intents or action we triggers or commands or whatever you would like to call it. And we can simply log that and also log our full state. And then we could use some tools like Crashlytics and log our live application or production application if it makes sense for our application to do so. We could log each state, each action that triggered the state change, and so on. So we can easily reproduce and debug our MVI application.
That's exactly what I was going to ask, in fact. I was going to ask you, can you talk a little about that? Have you used this actually in production? Have you been able to leverage this model view intent pattern and seen, hey, I got this bug, I got this app crash in my application, and maybe in Crashlytics, every time I get a crash, I'm just dumping my Hannes model, as a string representation. Have you gone back to see, let's see what happens if I actually dump this representation of the model in my tests and see if my app crashes? Is that how you have approached this?
Yeah, exactly. So we do that I did that in the company I've worked previously. So that helped us a lot with getting some strange, bugs reproduced. I know quite often I have talked to my manager and said that I can't reproduce this bug. So let's close this Jira issue ticket, and
not
I can't
reproducible.
Yeah. So that excuse is not valid anymore.
Well, you can give the excuse. Just don't tell him you're using the model view intent pattern. Him or
yeah, that's a good tip. Yeah. One note about that is that probably you won't log everything or anything. So there's a small balance between keeping some private or sensitive data really private and doing logging. That's up to you and your use case.
One of the things I wanted to bring up that folks may be wondering, okay, if we're not going to use, you said this before, if we're not going to use mocking for this testing and stuff like that, you said, but you may still mock the HTTP layer. If folks are interested, you can use something like mock web server, or I watched a talk at DroidCon NYC by Sam Edwards for wire mock. That also provides other functionalities. Of course, you can write your own, but those are some libraries that you can use. But what really grabbed me during this conversation about model view intent, and we're passing around the intents and the models, and we're rendering the state of that model to the screen, is this feels very unidirectional data flow kind of pattern. Is that the goal, or is that just kind of the side effect of the pattern?
Yeah, that's definitely the goal. If you remember that I've mentioned that this pattern is coming from a framework called cycle.js. And actually it's called cycle because it's such a unidirectional cycle and data flow that involves all parts of UI, business logic, intent handling, state management, and so on. So it always goes in one direction and in a circle. Therefore the name cycle.js.
Wow.
And I guess that's what's meant by the unidirectional flow, right? At no point does your business logic directly talk to someone else, or at no point does your view directly talk to your business logic. If there's any talking that happens between any two entities, it has to happen in that exact same direction, right? Which is what is meant by unidirectional flow. It's not that
like a circular flow kind of, right?
Yeah. And the thing that confused me some time back was like, oh, wait, unidirectional flow. Because when you talk about this whole loading, sending the loading state, sending the success state or the error state, and maybe others didn't have this doubt in their minds, but I did. I was like, oh, wait, if it's unidirectional, doesn't that mean it always just... Unidirectional does not necessarily mean that the same thing can produce more than one event. It just means the direction is the same, right? So your business logic could shoot out the loading, the content, and the success, but it's still in the same direction. It's not that, after the loading is emitted, you have to go back to the intent, go back to the model, go all the way back to the business logic and emit the next thing. So I know it seems a little silly, but unidirectional in this is just about the direction. It's not necessarily about point to point.
Yeah. Exactly.
So I had one follow-up question with respect to this, the Hannes state management, right? The example that you gave with the login makes perfect sense. I'm sold. But if you actually work on a real world application, quickly that starts to become a little more complicated, right? For example, if this state, all the state did was login success, login error, and loading, sure, that makes sense. But what if, maybe you had, well, the login example is pretty straightforward. That's why we chose it. But assuming in the real world, I had to do two other operations, right? For example, maybe after logging in, I have to, I don't know, something else. I had like 3 more things that needed to happen in my login screen, right? I need to log into like 3 applications just for the sake of this example, right?
Two-factor auth or something like that.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. So in that case, how do I manage? Because then the state becomes really hard, right? Because initially when I started out using this pattern, one thing that I noticed was it was extremely complicated. I had to do like a combine latest. I had to make sure that my state was like managed in the right way. And one of your posts actually talks about this in detail, right? Like that's what, like, I guess the state, that's where the state reducer comes in. Can you talk to us about a little more on that topic? Like, how do you think about it? How do you deal with it? Is there a way that we can like sort of combine this? Because if you think about it, if there are 3 independent operations that I need to do, each of them have to emit like a loading. Each of them have to potentially emit like content or like, the success or the error states. What if one error is out? Does all like how do quickly, the number of permutations can like blow up, right? So that can get pretty complicated. Can you talk to us a little about that aspect of the pattern?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, actually, one could argue and say that is that state management thing really that important for such a simple use case like a login? I mean, I can do that with MVP quite easily. I would say, presenter.do login from my view, and then the presenter would say, okay, view.show loading true, and then the presenter would fire up the HTTP request and so on. So is that really required for such a simple screen? And as Kaushik has said, probably not for such a simple thing. But if we have 2 or 3 more operations, then state is really, really important, and state management is really, really important to keep yourself moving fast, And what you have mentioned is the concept of a state reducer actually also comes from the web called Redux, and it's also baked in MVI. But you may have to use it, you may don't have to use it. It depends on your use case. Whenever you have some scenario like you need to know what the current state is to move to the next state, then something like a state reducer makes sense. Actually, a state reducer is just a function, and RxJava has this scan operator or fold operator, whatever. Usually scan works best in that case, which takes a function that has one parameter, which is the previous state, and let's call it intent or command or whatever. Or actually, this is more like the result of the intent, like the HTTP response. So a state reducer takes the previous state and the HTTP response, and then computes the new state and returns that new state. So that's the principle of Redux. And that's the point where RxJava really shines, because RxJava can do that in asynchronous way. And if you look at Redux in the JavaScript world, they really don't, or they simply ignore the fact that asynchronously can also happen in Redux. And there are other middlewares like RxSaga or Redux Saga or Redux Duck, which basically are trying to solve that async problem, but it's so much simple to solve if you use RxJava or in the JavaScript world, RxJS. And actually there is a Redux Observable implementation, or a library called Redux Observable from the fine guys of Airbnb, which solved that for the web by using RxJS, which is the counterpart of RxJava in the web.
Do we have like an Android version of that Redux Observable thing?
Well, there are some libraries that are trying to do that. The thing is, do we really need that? That's a good question. That's really just a state machine, if we are honest. So you could build that from scratch very simple, very easily. You could build such a library. I think Groupon has open sourced something like Grox or whatever it is pronounced lately. And trying to do that, you can use that, of course. But that's basically part of your business logic. So MVI is more like how we would display the model to the view, and so on. And this Redux or state management or reducer functions or groks is more in the business logic layer. And we could say it's a little bit out of scope of MVI per se, but it makes perfectly sense to use something like that in combination with MVI, and especially with RxJava.
I like your idea, but you could come up with this thing like essentially the idea with the state reducer is like, okay, given this input, you have to come up with like the output state, right? Like, and you can do whatever you need to, like, use RxJava, use scan, use anything that you want in order to produce that state. But in the end, that is just like you said, a state machine, and you could do anything to produce that. Given this input, produce that output, right? It goes back to like the whole functional thing.
Yeah, exactly. So you can also use functional programming concepts like category. I think you have mentioned the talk by, what was his name? Jorge Castillo.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. You could use this library he and some other Spanish guys are working on. And yeah, they are working on a nice library for Kotlin, which is called category. And it provides more, let's say, idiomatic functional programming concepts for Kotlin. So if you want to go really wild, you could use that. If RxJava works for you, you could use that. If live data works for you, you could use that. You don't necessarily have to implement MVI the way I did or I suggested. You could, but the thing that is really important is state management from my point of view. So you could use MVP perfectly fine if you want to. You could use MVVM perfectly fine as it is today, but do yourself a favor and at least do some proper state management in the business logic.
That makes perfect sense. And I love that point that you mentioned. You don't have to implement it exactly the same way. In fact, with your existing architecture, you could totally start to introduce the state management, right? Like maybe on one screen, start managing your state this way. That is like the crux of this pattern. It isn't necessarily about the specifics in how each of these things are implemented. Sure, you could derive like inspiration from that, but the whole objective is obviously, to get that state management. That is like the Hannes model. That is the key to this pattern.
Yeah, and actually there were also some other presentations by Jake Wharton who talked about this pattern at DevFox last year.
Absolutely, yeah. Managing reactive state, I think, or, reactive state management. We'll make sure to add links to those in the show notes. Yeah.
Yeah, and also Christina Lee and Brandon Case talked about this pattern I think 2 years ago, something like that. But they were actually trying to port cycle.js 1-to-1 to Android.
Got it. Yeah.
Which I don't think it's nice to do, but it's probably not the best way to do. So because Android has
the platform adds certain restrictions which make it a little trickier, right? Like to work around.
Yeah.
So
exactly. Yeah. But it was definitely a great talk, so you probably should check that out.
Absolutely.
So this sounds fantastic, but as with everything in software engineering, there comes a point where there are some downsides to whatever we're doing, if it's a pattern, if it's hardware, if it's software, whatever. There's always a downside somewhere. What are the downsides of using the MVI pattern, if there are any from your perspective?
Well, quite often I hear something like, now I have to write so much more code. But I don't think that that's actually true, because if you think at your MVP or MVVM based architecture, you probably have some state management code in your activity. You probably have some state management code in your in your presenter or in your recycler view adapter. And so on. And if you take that code and push it to the business logic, then it's basically just the same code you write, but it's now in one place, organized and well maintainable for you. So I don't think that you are actually writing more code. The only thing probably you would write more is you probably would write some commands or intent classes. It depends on the use case. So probably you would have something like login intent class, which you wouldn't have had in MVP or MVVM. So probably yes, but let's be honest, in Kotlin, there's 2 lines of code, since it's basically just a data class or something like that. So I don't think that it has huge disadvantages regarding to the advantages you get, like proper state management, easy testability, flexibility. And you can also build some kind of simple, small MVI units you can reuse quite often. So there are a lot of things you get from this pattern compared to the disadvantages like writing a few more classes like intents or seed classes for proper state management.
Right. I think it totally is true. A lot of the stuff that you said, like a lot of the bridging code, like the glue logic is something that might be a little extra. But I like your response that actually it isn't necessarily more code. You're just putting them all in one place versus, distributing them. Because you're totally right. What will happen is it'll start as a very simple flow, like a login flow success, and everyone's happy. You ship it, then you realize 3 edge cases. So then you come back and then you write code to fix those 3 edge cases. And a lot of that is just the state management, right? Like what if X happens and Y happens? Oh, I didn't manage that case. Let's go write some code there. So this is gradually how over the life of the application, you start to write more state management code. And then because it's distributed across the application, like, invariably it ends up being really difficult. You have more bugs. But if you start off like with this, I think you put it very well. Like the beauty with this pattern is it's all neatly organized in one place. So in fact, a lot of those edge cases are revealed to you because when you actually look at all the state together, then you can imagine the other combinations, right? Hannes, we could keep going on again for another hour, but this has been so much fun and it's been long overdue. Thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been really fun.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
If folks are interested and want to maybe, get resources on like where to start with this MVI pattern, right? What would you suggest?
There is the cycle.js website. So if you know a little bit of JavaScript, you probably would go through some of the introduction material there just to get an idea of why this pattern has been involved and which kind of problem it solves. If you would like to know more about how to apply it on Android, you could read my blog if you want to. So now a little bit self-advertisement, but yeah.
No, it's fantastic. It's one of the best series, especially delving with this pattern. And I'm saying this out of personal experience, right? One of my colleagues also wrote this post. He calls it the LCE sort of pattern, right? I'll make sure to add a link to that as well. But I would say your 7-part series is one of the best I've actually read that goes in because you've taken each thing. So I would suggest listeners, take that cup of coffee, devote maybe like half an hour of the day saying, today I'm going to look at the Hannes model, open up part 1. And then by the end of part 7, you'll come out. It's one of those things, right? Initially, for people who don't understand the benefit of the pattern, they'd start off thinking, oh, who's going to write this? There's like so much more code. Like, I don't need this. But I promise you, once you've understood these concepts and gone through this whole 7-part series, you will come out as a better programmer. You'll come out with definitely at least more ideas and inspiration for dealing with these things better. So I'll make sure to add every single part there in the show notes. I think this is like a fantastic intro.
Very well said.
You're too kind.
Hannes, if I have more questions, if I want to ask if my view should have a reference to the presenter, I want to troll you that way. What's the best way to reach you?
Probably the best way is to reach me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is at SOCKEQWE.
What's the story there? There's a story there. Because this is your handle in most places.
Yeah, I was born in a time when, nobody has, or when Facebook wasn't a thing and nobody was using his real name on the internet. So that's coming from a German, like it's soccer, which means socks, and yeah, QE is basically just a free character from the keyword, because on the left top corner. Yeah.
Oh,
that's funny.
Oh, interesting. Oh, got it. Okay. That's
So yeah, that's probably the best way. But you can also comment on my blog post on certain stuff, also on my GitHub projects. I'm usually very responsive there too. Yeah.
Fantastic. And you also are a co-host of the Context Podcast. We'll add a link to that. It's a fantastic podcast. Folks should definitely take a listen to that as well.
Oh, thank you.
And Don, if I want to bug you about presenters, views, your ideas, should I be using MVC or should I go hipster and use a different pattern altogether? What's the best way to do that?
Folks can reach me at Don Felker on Twitter. And Kaushik, you have spoken about MVP and MV stuff for a while now. What if folks want to get a hold of you and ask you your opinions?
I am Kaushik Gopal on Twitter. That's usually the best way to reach me as well. And I'd like to announce I'm coming up with a new architecture pattern. It's called it's the Vim pattern. It's the let me think about this. It's the view intention Hannes model pattern. That's the one. It's basically just a rebranding of the existing pattern, but that's what I'm going to call it. I'm going to call it the Vim pattern. So you can ask us questions on that. Anyway, Hannes, again, thank you so much for coming on the show. This is long overdue.
Thank
we
you.
both are super excited to have had this conversation. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right, folks. Thanks for listening. We will catch you in the next episode. Once again, we want to thank Rollbar for sponsoring today's show. With Rollbar's error monitoring, you get the context, insights, and control that you need to find and fix your bugs faster. We have a special offer for Fragmented listeners. Go to rollbar.com/fragmented, sign up, and get their Bootstrap plan for free. Thanks again, Rollbar. That's it for the show, folks. Fragmented is hosted by Don Felker and me, Kaushik Gopal. We edit and produce all the episodes here on Fragmented. Sarah the Amazing Jackson from the Spec Network helps with production assistance and wraps our final mix. Our theme and ad music is by the national recording artist Blueprint from Weightless Recordings. You can find more Fragmented episodes at fragmentedpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you in the next episode.